Welcome back to Family Shadows, the channel where we explore the quiet corners of family life, the places where sacrifice, disappointment, love, and redemption intertwine. These are the stories that rarely make the headlines but live in the rooms of ordinary homes. If you are new here, I invite you to subscribe and join this circle of reflection. Each week, we open a door into a family's private shadows. Sometimes you will nod, recognizing your own parents, your own children, your own unspoken regrets. Other times you will simply sit back, listening, and wonder, what would I have done? Today's story carries a title that feels both bitter and strangely triumphant. My kids said I was only good for babysitting, so I took back their free time. George was 68 years old, and if you had passed him on the street, you might not have noticed him. He was not the kind of man who drew attention. He walked with a slight stoop, wore plain shirts, and kept his hands tucked in the pockets of his worn khakis. Yet behind that quiet exterior was a lifetime of labor, loss, and a reservoir of patience deeper than most people could imagine. His house, tucked into a quiet neighborhood outside Cincinnati, carried the marks of both love and time. The siding needed a fresh coat of paint. The garden, once Margaret's pride, was a little overgrown, daisies stretching unevenly toward the sun. The driveway held a 10-year-old sedan with faded paint but an engine that still started on the first try. Inside, though, the home was warm. The shelves were lined with photographs, Margaret in her wedding dress, George holding baby Emily for the first time, Ryan blowing out candles at his 5th birthday. The pictures told the story of a family, frozen in moments that once felt eternal. Now they served as companions to George's solitude. Every morning, he brewed himself a cup of black coffee and sat at the wooden dining table. The sunlight through the blinds cut the room into stripes, and George would sit quietly, sometimes reading the paper, sometimes staring at nothing at all. He missed the sound of Margaret humming in the kitchen, the clatter of pans, the scent of cinnamon when she baked. He missed being a man with a partner, but he had his children, or so he thought. Emily, 35, lived across town. She worked in marketing and carried herself with the urgency of someone always chasing the next promotion, the next bigger house, the next shinier car. Her children, Lily and Jack, were George's treasures. Lily, 7, with her mother's dark hair, and Jack, 5, with a mischievous grin. When they ran to George's arms, he felt something ignite inside him, something that had dimmed after Margaret's passing. Ryan, 32, was different. He was unmarried, climbing the corporate ladder in finance. His phone was always buzzing, his emails piling up, his words quick and impatient. He rarely had time for more than a short visit, and when he did show up, it was often with the air of a man fulfilling an obligation. To the kids, George was a hero. To Emily and Ryan, he was convenient. "Dad, could you watch the kids Saturday, just for a few hours?" Emily would say, breezing into the house without waiting for an answer. "Dad, I have this networking event tonight. It's really important. Can you cover for me?" Ryan would text, as if George's evening was automatically empty. It wasn't that George disliked watching his grandchildren. On the contrary, those were some of his happiest hours, teaching Jack how to grip a baseball bat, showing Lily how to stir pancake batter without spilling flour across the counter. With them he was needed, loved without condition. But it was the way his children asked, no, expected, that chipped away at him. Babysitting was no longer a favor, it was a duty. His identity, in their eyes, had narrowed to one function, the free caretaker. George's knees ached more these days. His vision blurred sometimes when he read. He had a doctor's appointment scheduled for the coming Friday, a checkup he had been postponing for too long. Margaret would have scolded him for waiting this long. "You can't take care of us if you don't take care of yourself," she used to say. But now there was no Margaret to remind him, only his own quiet sense of duty. That week, Emily called. "Dad, we're planning a little getaway this weekend. Just 2 nights in Nashville. We need you to watch Lily and Jack. Friday through Sunday, it'll mean the world to us." George hesitated. "Friday, I have a doctor's appointment." There was a pause. Emily's tone shifted, soft but firm. "Dad, can't you reschedule? It's just a checkup. The kids adore you, and honestly, we need this. You know how stressful life has been." George swallowed the protest rising in his throat. He could hear Ryan in the background, his voice cutting in. "Come on, Dad, it's just one appointment. You can do it next week. You're always at home anyway. We really need this trip." George felt his chest tighten. They weren't asking, they were telling. His health was negotiable, their leisure was not. And so he nodded, though they couldn't see it. "All right," he said quietly. "Bring them over." After hanging up, George sat at the dining table staring at Margaret's picture. Her eyes seemed to look back at him, full of questions he could not answer. He touched the frame gently. "I guess they think that's all I'm good for," he whispered. He didn't shout. He didn't slam the table. That was not George's way. Instead, he carried the hurt inside like a stone in his chest. His children had reduced him to a role, stripping away the man who had once worked 2 jobs to put food on the table, who had stayed up nights fixing leaky roofs, who had carried Margaret through chemotherapy. Now to them, he was just the babysitter, but George was not as powerless as they believed. What Emily and Ryan never knew was that years earlier, George had invested in a small neighborhood café. It was Margaret's idea. She loved the thought of supporting local businesses. George had put in a modest sum, enough to give him a quiet share of ownership. Over the years, the cafe had grown, expanded, become something of a local favorite. His stake was worth far more now than when he first wrote that check. He never mentioned it to Emily or Ryan. It was his secret, a reminder that he had not given every piece of himself away. That Friday, while his children packed their suitcases and dropped off the kids with detailed instructions about snacks and bedtime, George made another call. He scheduled a meeting with the cafe's co-owners. He told them he was ready to sell his shares. The appointment with the doctor would wait, but so would babysitting. George was tired of being taken for granted. Friday came with the steady hum of cicadas outside George's window. The late summer air clung heavy, carrying with it the smell of cut grass from the neighbors' yards. George brewed his coffee, just as he always did, but the warmth did little to soothe the tightness in his chest. By 9 o'clock, Emily's SUV pulled into the driveway. The doors opened in a flurry, suitcases tumbling out, children spilling onto the pavement, their laughter rising like sparrows in the morning air. "Grandpa!" Lily shouted, racing to wrap her arms around his waist. Jack followed, dragging a backpack twice his size. George bent low, hugging them, inhaling the scent of crayons and bubblegum shampoo. These moments were pure, untouched by expectation. He closed his eyes briefly, holding onto them as if they were air. Emily walked up briskly, sunglasses perched atop her head, her phone still in hand. "Dad, thank you so much for this. You're a lifesaver." Ryan trailed behind, tapping something on his phone, barely glancing up. "We'll be back Sunday night. They've got snacks in the bag. Bedtime is 8 and Lily has her dance practice worksheet. Make sure she doesn't skip." George nodded silently, his hand resting on Jack's shoulder. Emily leaned in, lowering her voice, though the words carried a sharpness that stung. "Dad, please just keep up with them. You know how much energy they have. And try not to let them eat too much sugar. Last time." "Emily," George interrupted softly, "I've raised children before." Her cheeks flushed, but she quickly masked it with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. We have our routines." Ryan clapped George on the back, more perfunctory than affectionate. "Appreciate it, Dad. We couldn't do this without you." He slipped into the passenger seat, already dictating into his phone. George watched as the SUV backed out of the driveway, dust rising behind its tires. The laughter of Lily and Jack pulled him back. "Grandpa, can we make pancakes?" Lily asked, her eyes shining. "Of course," George said, forcing a smile. "Pancakes it is." It wasn't just this weekend. It had been months, years, really, of similar exchanges. Emily's business trips, Ryan's networking events, dinners, dates, errands, all slid neatly onto George's shoulders with the same assumption. Dad is free. Dad is available. Dad will do it. The truth was, George rarely said no. It wasn't in his nature. He had lived his life in service, first to his parents, then to his wife, then to his children. Saying yes felt like breathing. Saying no felt like betrayal. Yet lately, the requests had begun to stack on top of each other like bricks, building a wall that left little room for George's own needs. His doctor's appointment was just one more thing pushed aside, buried under their urgency. One Tuesday, Emily called mid-afternoon. "Dad, Lily's school let out early. Can you pick her up? I'm stuck at work." George was in the middle of fixing a leaky faucet in the kitchen. He set the wrench down, wiped his hands, and drove across town. On Thursday, Ryan showed up unannounced. "Dad, I've got a client dinner. Can you keep Jack for the night? Just crash on the couch if you need to." George looked at his calendar on the fridge, where a circled reminder of his postponed doctor's visit seemed to mock him. He sighed and nodded. It wasn't that George resented the children, far from it. They were his light. What hurt was the invisibility, the way Emily and Ryan looked past him as though his time had no weight. At the grocery store, he'd overheard Emily talking on the phone. "Yeah, Dad's got nothing going on. He can watch them. Honestly, he loves it, gives him something to do." Something to do, as if his life was empty space, waiting to be filled with their needs. As if his health, his solitude, his grief for Margaret were background noise in a play where they were the stars. That night, George sat at the dining table, staring at the photos on the wall. Margaret's smile seemed both comforting and accusing. He whispered to her frame, "They don't see me anymore, Maggie. Not as a father, not as a man, just as a service." The following week, Emily called again, her tone bright but rehearsed. "Dad, Ryan and I are planning another weekend trip. Just 2 nights, nothing big. You'll have the kids, right?" George hesitated. His chest tightened. He thought of the pills on his nightstand, the ache in his knees, the fatigue that settled heavier each morning. Emily, I was thinking I should schedule that doctor's appointment again, the one I missed." There was silence. Then a sigh. "Dad, you're fine. It's just a checkup. Don't be dramatic. We really need this trip. Honestly, we can't do it without you." Her words cut deep, not in their cruelty, but in their casual dismissal. To her, his health was negotiable. Her leisure was not. Ryan chimed in from the background, his voice muffled but sharp. "He'll do it. Dad's always home. What else is he gonna do?" George closed his eyes. His fingers tightened around the phone. The old George, the one who lived for peace, who swallowed his needs to keep harmony, almost answered with the familiar word, yes. But this time something shifted. George had always worn the same kind of smile, the modest, neighborly kind that never asked much of the world. On him, it was not costume but conviction. He believed there were better uses for breath than explaining yourself. When the roof leaked, you climbed and patched. When a tire hissed flat, you rolled up your sleeves. When a child cried, you hummed a tune and waited for the storm to pass. Words were for the gaps action could not cover, and so most days George did not talk much. He just went about the business of being useful. To Emily and Ryan, usefulness had become the shape of their father. When they pictured him, they did not see a young man catching his breath on a night shift or a husband learning Margaret's chemo schedule by heart. They saw the present tense, a retiree in a quiet house, a car in the driveway, a calendar with room. The past, with all its weight, had gone invisible, the way beams of a house go unseen until the roof fails. On Tuesday afternoon, George stood on a step stool fixing the kitchen light. The fixture had begun to hum and flicker, a moth trapped in a jar. He held a new bulb in one hand and the rim of the glass shade in the other, feeling the ache gather in his wrists as he worked. The ache had been his uninvited companion all spring, moving through him the way a slow drizzle sinks into soil, patient, thorough, ignored until the ground turns to mud. When the bulb clicked in, the yellow cone of light filled the room. On the counter waited his list: milk, bread, honey, acetaminophen, a new blood pressure cuff. The old one had torn last week. He tucked the list into his pocket, slid the stool back against the wall, and took a minute at the sink, hands braced on the edge. If he leaned there just so, the pulling in his lower back loosened its teeth. He glanced at the refrigerator. The calendar hung beneath a magnet shaped like a cardinal. A square of the coming Friday was circled in red. Dr. 10:00 a.m. His letters were careful, the way he had written instructions for Margaret the year she first forgot where they kept the sugar. The circle was a promise made to himself, and perhaps if he allowed the tenderness to her. He had not always circled things. In the years after Margaret died, days bled into one another, and he moved through them like a man wading a river he knew by memory. Then the aches began to organize themselves. Mornings were for stiffness, afternoons for the shortness in his breath, evenings for the little tremor in his right hand when he lifted a mug. He looked up the nearest clinic, listened to hold music, and took the first available appointment. Friday 10:00, a sentence simple enough that might bend the paragraph of his days. He made a sandwich, peanut butter and honey, the bread pressed flat by his palm the same way he'd done for Emily when she was 8 and the world frightened her. Halfway through, his phone vibrated with a text: "Can you do school pickup?" They moved dismissal up, heat advisory. It was from Emily, followed by a quick thanks, as if the thing had already happened. He rinsed his plate, grabbed his keys and left. At the elementary school curb, the heat sat on the pavement like a sleeping dog. Children spilled out carrying water bottles and construction paper crowns. Lily marched to the car wearing a crown of blue triangles and tape. "Grandpa, are you a good driver?" she asked, climbing in. "I'm something of a legend," he said, and watched her grin in the rearview mirror. "Mom says you drive slow." "Mom likes to get there fast," he said. "I like to get there." She kicked her heels against the seat and hummed, the tune changing every few seconds the way radio stations do on a long road. At a stoplight, George pressed his fingers into the meat of his palm where the tremor sometimes started. Today it was quiet. He exhaled. Back at the house, Lily asked for popsicles. "2." She negotiated, holding up the fingers like a lawyer. He countered with 1.5. They settled, as they often did, on 1 and a lick. "Do your hands hurt?" she asked suddenly, watching him twist the wrapper. Sometimes, George said. Why do you ask? Your face got squinty, she said. That's your hurting face. George smiled. I have a face for everything. What's your happy face? This one, he said, and widened his smile, and it wasn't entirely a lie. Later, after cartoons and the small rain of cracker crumbs, Lily napped on the couch with an elbow thrown over her forehead like a tiny dramatic heroine. George watched the slow rise and fall of her chest and felt the most honest form of love, a love that wanted nothing, asked nothing, just stood guard. His phone buzzed again. Ryan, client dinner tonight, running late. Can you keep Jack overnight? We'll swing by in the morning. No please, no question mark, only the punctuation of schedule. George pictured the fridge calendar. The red circle held steady. He typed yes and set the phone down. Saying yes, he had learned, was a kind of peacekeeping. It was also a kind of erosion. At night, after Lily had been picked up and Jack had fallen asleep with 2 fingers resting against his lips, George sat at the dining table under the new warmed light. He brought out the plastic pill organizer Margaret used to tease him about. You finally got old enough to sort your week like laundry, she said once, and they had both laughed because aging had still been a story they could tell in jokes. He clicked open the little boxes. Mon, too, Wed listening to each as if a cent could be counted by sound. He found the letter from the café tucked inside a stack of mail, a quarterly statement cleanly typed. The numbers meant less to him than the feeling of them, the way years of small belief can compound into something with heft. He ran a thumb over the paper. He hadn't thought of the café as security. It was Margaret's project, her gentle argument for investing in the small. Still, it soothed him to know there was a corner of his life that did not depend on anyone else's approval. A place where his quiet had not been mistaken for emptiness. He turned the letter face down and lifted his gaze to the wall of photographs. Margaret in her wedding dress, chin tipped forward as if she were charging into the years. Emma and Ryan with ice cream on their mouths, both outraged that a summer treat could melt. In one photo, George stood with a hand on the little of Margaret's back. A gesture so natural he hadn't known it had been captured until much later. He tried to remember the sound of her laugh. It came back in fragments, like birdsong through a half-open window. Before bed, George placed his wallet and keys in a small ceramic bowl by the door. The bowl had a hairline crack that traced the rim like a river on a map. He touched the crack with his finger and wondered idly if the fault lines in objects and in bodies could warn you before they gave way. When he lay down, the house made its nighttime sounds, the refrigerator's low throat, the vents flexing, the sharp tick of the baseboard heating as it cooled. He tried to still his mind around the red-circled square. He pictured the clinic's waiting room, a stack of outdated magazines, a fish tank where someone had forgotten to scrape the glass, a receptionist who called names into the air like a question. He would bring a book, he decided. He would say yes, for once, to himself. Sleep arrived in pockets. In one of them, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the sunlight on her shoulder. You can't pour from an empty cup, Georgie, she said, and slid his hand a glass of water. When he woke, his palm was open, as if he were still reaching. Wednesday unscrewed itself and rolled through its tasks. George trimmed the hedges, carefully, mindful of the tug in his lower back. He took out the trash. He drove to the hardware store for a box of cabinet screws and came back with a packet of zinnia seeds, because the picture on the front promised colors the yard had forgotten. At lunch, he ate a bowl of soup he had frozen 2 months ago, and made a note to cook again on Sunday. He liked the feeling of a freezer with options. It meant some version of his past self kept showing up to help. In the late afternoon, a neighbor named Hank from 2 houses down ambled over with a post-hole digger balanced like a yoke across his shoulders. Hank was the kind of man who always looked like he had just finished a useful task. "Fence lines giving me hell," he said. "You still have that spare sledge." George handed it over and after a moment's consideration, went along to spot him. "I thought you were retired," Hank said, grinning without meanness. "I am," George said. "How's that treating you?" "It depends which part," George said, and they both laughed because it was easier than explaining. They wrestled a stubborn post loose, and when it finally came, Hank whooped, and George felt a familiar pinch race down his right leg like a struck chord. He braced on the handle until the song quieted. "You all right?" Hank asked, glancing over. "Just catching my breath." George let the seconds pass until his face could keep its own secrets again. "You should set the new one in gravel, gives the water somewhere to go." "A man who knows his business," Hank said. "My boy could use a lesson in that." They knocked the dust from their hands. On the walk home, George stepped carefully, noticing now the way the pain bloomed and receded like breath on a mirror. He told himself again, in the firm voice he used when he changed light bulbs or tightened hinges, that Friday mattered. Thursday morning brought the kind of blue sky that made everything below it feel temporary. George watered the zinnias he had not yet planted. He stood with the hose in his hand and watched the dirt darken, his thumb pressed over the spout to fan the stream into a soft rain. The act calmed him, the way simple tasks often do. There is a dignity to tending the small. Inside, he sat with a legal pad and began a list no one had asked him to make. Questions for the doctor. He wrote them in the same block letters. How often the dizzy spells, which joints hurt, whether the fatigue after lunch was normal. He added vision and underlined it. He put a star by short of breath on stairs. When he finished, he read the list twice, as if the act of rehearsal could lend courage. He turned the page and, without meaning to, wrote things I still want. The words looked strange in his handwriting, as if a younger man had broken into the house and used his pen. He hesitated, then set the point to paper, plant the zinnias, fix the back step, take Lily to a baseball game, teach Jack to make pancakes without burning them, call Tom from the café. He stopped there, struck by the way that last item had slipped onto the page like a guest at the end of a wake. He did not cross it out. In the afternoon, Emily texted a photo of Lily in her dance class, arms lifted, one foot pointed like a chisel. "Isn't she getting so tall?" George wrote back, "Magnificent," and meant it. He stood and stretched his back and fetched the mail and sorted it into stacks, until the table looked briefly like a desk in a sensible office where someone respectable worked. The sun slid down the street. He fried an egg and set it on toast and ate slowly, measuring his bites. He washed the plate and set it in the rack and wiped the counter with the corner of a towel, as if erasing a small chalkboard. Then he walked to the refrigerator, touched his index finger to the red circle on Friday, and felt the small thrum of a man who has made a plan and intends to keep it. Night settled. He set the coffee maker for morning. He lined up his pillbox. He clicked off the kitchen light and left the dining room lamp on. Habit, more than anything. A house likes a little company. At the threshold to the hall, he looked back once, the way you do when you're leaving a place and want to memorize it without meaning to. In bed, the first half hour was a negotiation. The hip argued with the shoulder, the knee lobbied for breath, the mind filed petitions citing what-ifs and remember-whens. Eventually, the body yielded a corridor through which sleep could pass. He dreamed of a ball game he had taken Ryan to once, a day so bright their hats cast sharp little moons on their foreheads. In the dream, Margaret sat behind them handing peanuts down the row. When he turned to smile at her, the crowd rose and she dissolved into their cheering. Just before dawn, he woke to the sound of a truck shifting gears at the corner. The light through the blinds drew even bars across the ceiling. His hand had drifted to the place on the sheet where Margaret used to sleep. He left it there a moment, the way you leave your palm on a stone warmed all afternoon by the sun. He poured coffee. He stood at the sink while the kettle folktailed its way to a boil, steam rising like a thought. He set the mug on the table and unfolded the legal pad and read his list as if someone else had written it and entrusted him with the errand. He nodded once. The nod was small and private and cost him nothing. He liked that about certain promises. They could be kept quietly. The house phone, which rang so seldom that its sound arrived like news, jolted the air. George looked at the display. Emily. He set his finger on the talk button and felt, for a brief and traitorous second, the weight of all his old nods stack up inside his chest like books. Then he drew a breath that reached all the way down and pressed. The phone buzzed on the kitchen table, its vibration rattling against the ceramic bowl that held George's keys. He looked at the screen. Emily. He hesitated for just a breath, the way a man might pause before opening a door he already knows the other side of. Then he pressed the button. "Dad," Emily began, her voice high and hurried, "we've been planning this Nashville trip for weeks. I need you to watch the kids Friday through Sunday. We'll drop them off early." George's fingers tightened around the receiver. "Emily, I have a doctor's appointment Friday morning. It's important. I've been waiting a long time for this one." There was silence, the kind that doesn't belong to surprise but to calculation. Then came the sigh. "Dad, it's just a checkup. You can reschedule, please. We really need this. You know how much stress I've been under at work, and Ryan hasn't had a single weekend off in months." From the background, Ryan's voice slid in, sharp and impatient. "He can move it. It's no big deal. Dad's always free." Always free. The words sank into George like stones in deep water. He thought of the red circle on his fridge calendar, the careful letters spelling out Dr. 1000 A.M. He thought of Margaret's voice echoing through memory. "You can't pour from an empty cup, George." And yet, as Emily waited and Ryan muttered, he felt the familiar pull, the habit of a lifetime, keeping peace, absorbing the burden, saying yes so others could live freely. His lips moved before his mind caught up. "All right," he said quietly, "bring them by." The relief in Emily's voice came like a flood. "Thank you, Dad, you're the best. Really, we couldn't do this without you." Ryan didn't even take the phone. "Thanks, Dad," he called distantly, already half gone. The call ended. George sat very still. The house seemed to lean into its silence, walls and windows holding their breath. On the wall across from him, Margaret's photograph. Her smile, tilted in that way that always hinted at mischief, looked almost stern now. "I guess I'm not going," he whispered. "Not yet." He rubbed at his knees, the ache answering him like an old friend. Behind his faint smile, behind his quiet nod, something else stirred, an exhaustion too heavy to ignore, and a seed of something new, something he had not felt in years. The urge to push back, even if gently. The line had been crossed, and George, though silent, had noticed. Friday morning arrived dressed in gold. Sunlight slipped through the blinds and painted long bars across the dining table. George sat there as he always did, a mug of coffee cooling between his hands, his eyes fixed on the red circle he had drawn days earlier on the calendar. Dr. 10:00 a.m. It should have been today. Instead, the calendar had become another broken promise to himself. His children's laughter, their urgency, their demands. Once again they had been given precedence over his aching joints and shortness of breath. He had said yes, just as he always had. On the surface, nothing seemed different. He wore the same plain shirt, poured his coffee the same way, set out 2 bowls for the grandchildren's cereal. When Emily's SUV pulled into the driveway, George rose from his chair, smiling as he opened the door. "Grandpa!" Lily squealed, running into his arms. Jack followed, clutching his stuffed bear like a travel companion. George's smile was soft and genuine for the children. He lifted Lily into the air, though his back winced in protest, and kissed Jack's hair. With them, there was no pretense. Their love was still the kind that asked for nothing more than presence. Emily trailed behind with her sunglasses and lists. She rattled off instructions, bedtime routines, snack limits, Lily's dance practice, Jack's allergy medicine. She didn't pause long enough to see the way George's hands shook slightly as he folded the paper. Ryan honked the horn from the car. "Let's go, Em, we'll hit traffic." Emily gave her father a quick kiss on the cheek. "Thank you, Dad, you're the best, really. We couldn't do this without you." George nodded the way he always did, a small bow and unspoken surrender. "Drive safe," he said. The SUV rolled away and the street fell quiet again. Inside, George busied himself with the children. Pancakes on the skillet, cartoons on the television, the soft chaos of toys strewn across the living room rug. He laughed when Jack spilled syrup across the table. He clapped when Lily twirled in her new dance shoes. From the outside, it looked like contentment, the picture of a devoted grandfather. But beneath it all, a current ran steady and strong. Every nod, every quiet smile, every small agreement, these had become his performance of peace. What his children could not see, what they had never bothered to ask, was the cost of it. Behind his steady presence, George was tired. Behind his smile, he was bruised. The pain in his knees sharpened when he bent to pick up Jack's toys. The dizziness came and went, a ghost reminding him of the appointment he had missed that very morning. And through it all, the echo of Ryan's voice haunted him. "Dad's always free." That afternoon, when Lily napped on the couch and Jack built a crooked tower of blocks at his feet, George sat at the dining table with a folder spread before him. Inside were the café's quarterly statements, the quiet investment he had carried for years, almost forgotten. He traced his finger over the numbers, the evidence of steady growth. He remembered Margaret's laughter when they first signed the papers, her belief that small beginnings could bloom into something lasting. The smile that crossed George's face now was different. It wasn't the polite, automatic smile he wore for Emily and Ryan. It was something sharper, quieter, filled with resolve. For the first time in a long while, George felt the stirrings of a decision that belonged to him alone. He looked toward the living room, where the children slept and played, innocent of their parents' disregard. He loved them more fiercely than anything, but love did not mean surrendering every last piece of himself. He folded the papers neatly, slid them back into the folder, and placed it in the center of the table. His hand lingered there for a moment, pressing down as if sealing a vow. "Yes," he whispered, not to Emily, not to Ryan, but to himself. Yes to the doctor's appointment he would reschedule on his own terms. Yes to the dignity he had allowed to be eroded piece by piece. Yes, to the quiet plan forming behind his steady smile. When Emily called that evening to check in, her voice was casual, distracted. "Everything okay over there, Dad? Kids aren't driving you crazy, are they?" George chuckled softly. "We're managing just fine." "Good," she said, relief pouring out as quickly as it had the night she asked the favor. "I knew we could count on you." Another nod, another gentle "of course." But behind that agreement, behind the mask of the dependable father, George's mind was already elsewhere, on papers, on signatures, on a choice he had carried quietly for years. His children believed they knew him, believed his silence was compliance, his smile was surrender. They were wrong. For the first time in a long while, George was not simply saying yes. He was preparing. Saturday morning rose with the restless chatter of children. Jack was already scattering toy cars across the living room floor, narrating each crash with explosive sound effects. Lily twirled in her socks, humming a tune from her dance class. George moved through the kitchen slowly, pouring cereal, setting out spoons, filling juice glasses. He kept his face calm, his smile steady, though every movement of his knees carried a protest. "Grandpa," Lily called, "are we going to the park today?" "Maybe later," George said gently. "First, Grandpa has an errand." She frowned. "But Mom says weekends are for fun." George paused, looking at her small, certain face. He thought of Emily, that same stubborn certainty years ago, insisting she knew better, always pressing, always asking. He smiled softly at Lily. "Sometimes, Lily, errands are the way to keep fun alive." By 10 o'clock, George had arranged for his neighbor, Mrs. Hernandez, to watch the children for a few hours. She was happy to help. She loved having Lily and Jack in her garden where they picked tomatoes and chased her old beagle around the yard. George, meanwhile, dressed in his best, an ironed shirt, slacks pressed along the seams, and the jacket Margaret had once chosen for him on a long-ago anniversary. He hadn't worn it in years. When he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror, he hardly recognized the man staring back. Not just older, firmer. He slid the folder of café documents into a leather briefcase, one he had kept since his working days. It smelled faintly of old paper and ink, the scent of decisions and responsibilities. At the café downtown, the Saturday bustle had already begun. Students hunched over laptops, couples leaned across tables, families wrangled strollers and sipped lattes. The air was thick with the scent of roasted beans and sugar. George paused just inside the door, inhaling deeply. This place had been a seed once, just an idea Margaret had nudged him toward when a friend mentioned they needed investors. "You've always believed in hard work, George," she'd said. "Why not believe in someone else's too?" He had signed his name quietly, almost shyly, never imagining that the little cafe would grow into a neighborhood staple. Now, 2 decades later, his modest investment had multiplied into something significant. In the back office, George met with Tom, one of the co-owners. Tom was younger, energetic, still wearing the apron he'd been behind the counter in. "George," Tom said warmly, extending a hand. "It's been too long. How are you?" George shook his hand firmly. "I'm well enough." "It's time, Tom." He tapped the folder on the desk. "I'd like to sell my shares." Tom blinked, surprised. "You sure? You've been with us from the start." George nodded. "I'm sure. I've carried this quietly for a long time. Now it's time for me to carry something else myself." Tom studied him, then broke into a smile. "Well, you've earned every cent and more. The cafe wouldn't be what it is without you." They went through the papers together. Signatures were exchanged, hands shook, and with each pen stroke George felt something loosen inside him. Not regret, release. When it was done, Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "If you ever want to come in for a coffee, it's on the house, your family here." George smiled, a real one this time, full and unhidden. "Thank you, Tom. I'll take you up on that." On the drive home, the check rested safely in his briefcase. It wasn't fortune in the grand scheme of the world, but it was independence. It was proof that his life still held hidden strength, unseen by those who dismissed him. He thought of Emily and Ryan, their words, "Dad's always free. Dad's fine. Dad's got nothing else going on." They had no idea. George parked in his driveway, watching Lily chase Mrs. Hernandez's beagle across the yard while Jack waved a cherry tomato triumphantly in the air. The sight filled him with warmth and with clarity. He would always love them, his children, his grandchildren. That love was not negotiable. But love did not mean servitude. Love did not mean erasing himself until nothing was left but a smile and a nod. He stepped inside, placed the briefcase on the table, and rested his hand on it. The papers, the check, they were more than money. They were a line in the sand. For the first time in years, George had taken something back. Saturday afternoon passed in a blur of ordinary joys. Lily insisted on painting George's nails with sparkly polish, giggling at the sight of his big, weathered hands covered in glitter. Jack demanded a baseball lesson in the backyard, his swings wild but earnest. George obliged them both, his heart lightened by their laughter, though every step tugged at his aching joints. By evening, the children were tucked in with bedtime stories, Charlotte's Web for Lily, Goodnight Moon for Jack. Their breathing slowed, their small chests rising and falling in rhythm. George lingered in the doorway, watching them sleep. He thought of Emily and Ryan, hours away in Nashville, cocktails in hand, never questioning that their father would shoulder everything as he always had. But Sunday morning changed everything. It was nearly 10 when George's phone buzzed. Emily's name lit the screen. "Dad." Her voice was tight, panicked. "Where are you? The kids, they're not at the house. Mrs. Hernandez called me. She said she dropped them off yesterday afternoon, but you weren't home." George held the phone steady. "They're here, safe. I had to step out for a while, but I made arrangements. I don't leave them alone." "That's not the point," Emily snapped. "You can't just disappear. We counted on you." Ryan's voice erupted in the background. "Unbelievable. We trusted him with one simple thing and he—" George's voice cut through, calm but firm. "One simple thing, you've trusted me with everything, again and again, without ever asking if I could or if I wanted to." The silence on the other end was sharp, as if both of them had been slapped by the words they had never expected from him. That afternoon, Emily and Ryan arrived, their faces pale with fury and worry. They rushed past George into the living room, smothering Lily and Jack with anxious hugs. Emily turned, her voice trembling. "Dad, how could you? You knew how important this trip was for us." George stood by the dining table. The leather briefcase rested on it, papers neatly stacked inside. He touched it gently, then looked at his children. "I know how important many things have been for you," he said. "Your trips, your dinners, your promotions, and I've given them to you, without question. But yesterday I gave something to myself." Ryan scoffed. "What are you talking about?" George opened the briefcase, slid out the check, and placed it on the table. "I sold my shares in the café. Money I've kept quiet all these years. I used it to hire a home health aide, a nurse who will look after me when I need it. Someone who won't treat me like I'm just a babysitter." Emily's eyes widened. You never told us." "Because it wasn't yours to know," George said. His voice was steady, stronger than they had ever heard it. I've spent my life taking care of you, of your mother, of this family. I will always love you, but I will not do it at the cost of myself anymore." For a long moment the room was silent. The children, sensing the tension, clung to their toys, their wide eyes flicking between the adults. Ryan finally broke the silence, his voice cracking under the weight of pride. "So that's it. You're done helping us." George shook his head. "I'll always help when it matters, but not like this. Not when it erases who I am. I'm your father, not your free time, not your convenience. My love has boundaries now." Emily lowered her eyes, her voice softer than before. "Dad, we didn't mean to." "Yes," George interrupted, "you did, maybe not with cruelty, but with carelessness. And carelessness can wound just as deep." When the house quieted again, George sat alone at the dining table. The check was gone, locked safely in the drawer. The children's laughter drifted from the living room, untarnished by the storm that had passed. For the first time in years, the silence around him did not feel heavy. It felt earned. Behind his smile now was not exhaustion, but resolve. He had taken something back. And though Emily and Ryan might not yet understand, they would remember this weekend, the one where their father finally drew the line. That night, after Emily and Ryan had gone home, after the house had fallen quiet again, George sat by the window with the lamp casting a soft glow across the room. Outside, the street was still. A few porch lights flickered on, the neighborhood settling into its Sunday rest. On the couch, Lily and Jack had fallen asleep watching a movie, their small bodies curled against each other like kittens. George pulled a blanket over them, brushing a stray lock of hair from Lily's forehead. For all the turmoil of the day, the innocence of the children was untouched. They still loved him for his stories, his pancakes, his laughter. Nothing more, nothing less. He returned to the table and placed his hands flat against the wood, feeling the grooves Margaret had polished countless times. He could almost hear her voice. "You did right, George. You finally remembered yourself." For years, he had confused love with endless sacrifice. He believed that to be a good father was to erase himself, to nod and agree, to hold the line without complaint. But love without boundaries becomes servitude. Love without dignity becomes invisible. Now he understood, to love his children meant also teaching them the truth, that a father is not a service to be used, but a soul to be honored. His silence had been mistaken for weakness, his patience mistaken for emptiness. But he was neither weak nor empty. He was full of a life still worth protecting. When Emily called the next day, her voice was different, softer, uncertain. "Dad, I've been thinking about what you said. I'm sorry. We should have asked more. We should have seen more." George listened quietly. It wasn't forgiveness he sought, only acknowledgement. "I love you, Emily," he said. "But love has to move both ways. I'll always be here for you, but I need you to be here for me too." "I understand," she whispered. And for the first time in years, George believed she might. Ryan took longer. Pride often builds higher walls than cruelty. But even he would remember the firmness in his father's voice, the way George had drawn the line with dignity. Life returned to its rhythms, school pickups, pancake breakfasts, bedtime stories. But something had shifted. George no longer carried the invisible weight of endless yeses. He carried himself. And in that quiet victory, he found peace. And so ends the story of George, a man who taught his family that love is not measured by how much you give away, but by how much of yourself you choose to keep whole. His children learned a hard lesson, that behind a quiet smile can live a strength greater than anger, a strength born of dignity. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us through this journey on Family Shadows. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe so you don't miss the next one we share. Until then, take care of your health, treasure your loved ones, and remember, family love shines brightest when it is built on respect. I wish you peace, strength, and a home filled with happiness. Good night, and may your family always be your shelter.